Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. I know I say this all the time, but this really is my favorite time of week. It's great to have everybody here today, all our American friends, our Canadian friends. We got Rick and many others in Australia and New Zealand. Shout out to Trolled from Norway and Det Grower as well. This is just fantastic to have you all here, whether you're live or watching on replay. And today, let's talk about gardening and the garden specifically and how we can relax. Too often, gardening just gets overwhelming. This time of year, when the seasons change, can be a difficult time for many gardeners. For those of you that are in Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, you're just beginning your springtime. The garden's ramping up. All the focus is on the planning and the preparation and the planting. And sometimes it's kind of hard to relax. And then for the rest of us who are already experiencing cold weather, maybe snow's on the way, we've had winds, we've had thunderstorms, we've had hurricanes, we've had tornadoes, and the season is changing. And we're trying to figure out what happened. We have to get our harvests done. We have to prepare for the winter. And that just adds stress to what should be an enjoyable experience. So today I want to hear about some of the things you do to make gardening more relaxing. Designs, activities, things that you do in the garden and with the garden that really help you relax. And of course, I'll be sharing some of what I do, offer some tips, some ideas, and maybe by the end of the day, we'll all be a little more relaxed as we look to whatever's going to happen next in the garden. Hello to Chris from Calgary, Canada. Nice to have you here as well today. Colorado Bird Nerd is in Nebraska right now. So also nice to see you here in a new location. When I started thinking about the topic today, I have to admit it wasn't an original idea. I've had this idea before, but I hadn't intended on making it a live stream. It was actually Carla who suggested that I talk about this topic. And I think it is a wonderful idea because we often talk about how gardening is relaxing, how we like to go out in the garden, but we really don't try to figure out what it is about gardening or what it is about our garden that is relaxing, or from a different perspective, what we could do to make it relaxing. I I think most of us look at gardening as a hobby, and hobbies generally are enjoyable. And if we do it right, they tend to be relaxing. But a hobby can quickly become a chore. It becomes something that we have to get done because of the calendar, because of the weather, because of the money we put into it, because of the pressures we're feeling from outside. And that is one of the things about gardening. And I've seen it happen. It's happened to me as well, where it starts off as fun and then suddenly you're not enjoying it anymore. And if you're not enjoying it, it's really hard for it to be relaxing. So, you know me, I always encourage that you enjoy gardening. That leads to all of those other physical and mental benefits that gardening can bring. Sure, there's lots of chores. You have to weed. You have to do something about those insects. You have to do something about all the pests in your garden. You have to do something about the problems with your soil or with your climate. You have to figure out what you're going to grow, when you're going to grow it, how you're going to grow it, when you're going to harvest it. All of those things can become laborious. But ultimately, it comes down to some of these things that I think we should talk about. The first being, I encourage that you have a spot, at least one. I've got multiple spots because I've got a bigger space with multiple garden areas, but have at least a spot that is your relaxation spot. Use it as the the center point of your gardening experience. So if you're having a rough day, you go out to that spot. And it could be a standing spot, it can be a sitting spot, it can be a squatting spot, whatever it is that you prefer. But it's a location that has that consistency, that every time you go to it, you get that calming effect. And the center of my garden, as I've designed it for me, is one of those spots. That's where I've built my gazebo. It's slightly raised from all of the surrounding area. So I can stand or sit in the very center of my garden and then just observe, just soak in all of the garden's energy. And there are days that I'll take the dogs out, they'll be running around, and I'll just stand in that center point. And it is so calming and so relaxing. Even when the dogs are getting into my plants and breaking things, it really doesn't affect me as much because that's my relaxation point. It's where it's not that I've even made an effort to make it relaxing. It's just I recognize that that is the spot that is calming for me. And so I go there and it has that effect. Then I can move to other areas of the garden. I can do those other activities. I can do the chores. I can get the work done. And then in the middle of the work, when it's hot and I'm sore and sweaty and tired and thirsty, I just go back to that spot, sit, drink some water, cool down a little bit. And then after a brief period, I can start all over again. So, what's in your mind? What are you doing? Llama Llama has a great suggestion, and this is on my list today. Watering relaxes me. I get to watch all the bugs living their best lives. Well, some of them. I gaze over all of the plants, inspecting them as I go. I also enjoy sitting, watching everything. And I totally agree. I've mentioned this many times before that I hand water my garden. And one of the reasons I hand water my garden is for exactly these reasons. It gets me up close to the plants, to the insects, to the soil, to the mulch, but it's also the sound of the water. It's just the feeling maybe that I'm nourishing the plants and nourishing the soil. But absolutely, just spending some time out there. I'm not doing as much now as the weather's cooling and as the plants are starting to fade. But for most of my growing season, I'll do a deep water twice a week. So this is when I soak my trees. Of course, I water all of my garden, but I do extra water on the bushes. And it takes time. It takes me about an hour and a half to do the deep watering of my entire garden. And that's a relaxing activity for me. It's twice a week. Many people would say, "Wow, you got to spend an hour and a half watering your plants." No, I get to. I have the opportunity to spend an hour and a half watering all of my plants. And sure, it can be a chore if you like to think of it that way. But for me, it's a chance to see what's happening in the garden. It's that connecting with the garden, I think, that also brings relaxation. The observing the ladybugs on the leaves, and then over the course of the season, I posted a reel about this on my Instagram. I started noticing first all the ladybugs, but then as the season progressed, I started noticing the pupa stage of the ladybugs, where the ladybug larva would appear. That's fascinating to see the ladybug larva all over the leaves eating the aphids or whatever it is they find. But then the pupa emerges, and that's when the larva basically anchors itself to a leaf and then goes through the metamorphosis to become an adult. Well, you wouldn't necessarily see that if you weren't looking for those type of things happening in the garden. And that is, I can just sit and watch ladybugs, larva, pupa, adults. There's just something about a ladybug that I find relaxing. And then you can transfer that to any other insect, any other bird, whatever you find in the garden. The birds are another thing. I love just watching the birds, particularly the little golden finches that we have in this area of Colorado. And I leave my sunflowers up, and so I can sit in my relaxation chair and then watch the finches land on my sunflowers and just peck away at the little seeds. That's one of the things that I absolutely love. Dan Galamidi says, the bench in my garden is functional but not comfortable. Good for morning coffee and a quick rest while working. However, I have a hammock right next to it that I lay in to relax. There you go. I have a hammock as well, and I've been trying to figure out where I want to put that hammock. And I've spent years trying to figure out a good location, but I love that idea. The idea for me right now, it's a chair, but yeah, a hammock, a lounge chair of some type, a soft pad that you put out in the garden. If you like to do yoga, you can do yoga in the garden and use that as a way to relax and get your body just in tune with nature and everything that's happening. So wonderful, wonderful idea. Outlier Gardener says, making sure that I have a few seats and shaded areas available is key to relaxation. Nice running water feature, such as a little fountain, is a bonus. Absolutely. And water as a feature in your garden is on my list today as well. One of the things that I just feel the best about in all the many years of planning, designing gardens, building gardens, having gardens, helping others with gardens, one of the things that just today still gives me that feeling of accomplishment, and also helps me relax a little bit as I think about what I've done over the years in the garden, is to build a sensory garden. The true sensory garden I built at the Galileo School of Math and Science at the Galileo Garden was designed with all the senses in mind. And so we all typically have a favorite sense. When we talk about gardening, it could be the scent, the aroma. And so plant a garden maybe with roses or with your lilacs. For me, I've got the lilac bush, and it's only a brief period of the year, but when I walk through that part of my yard and I can smell the lilacs in bloom wafting through the air, there are a few things that are better than that. And so the sensory garden was designed to bring in different flowers at different times of year that could give those aromas. And then, of course, there's the tactile sensations. I grow lamb's ear because it's just kind of fun to rub the soft leaves of lamb's ear. That's always fun. Of course, the tasting can be better than harvesting the fresh tomatoes at this time of year. I just love every day now for a few weeks, and hopefully a few more weeks, going out, harvesting, bringing them in, and having a tomato salad. Just tomatoes, maybe tomatoes with some of my cucumbers, tomatoes with some of my mint, or tomatoes with some of my basil. But the tomatoes, just because they're so fresh from the garden, they taste so great. It's a way to calm down at the end of the day. I love doing that. And one of the things that I think we do so often, we don't make a point to highlight it, is the visuals. You can design a garden to be relaxing by choosing colors that you find relaxing. So if you like white as just a calming influence, then you plant a garden with flowers of all different sizes and textures and shapes, but they're white. Or maybe they're yellow, or maybe they're pink, but the color, the visual can really make a difference. And then to this point, the water, the sound. I think the sound, particularly running water, can be a very calming, a very relaxing feature in the garden. So if you don't have a water feature, consider it. I've got a bunch of videos on how you can make just small fountains to give you that sound, to give you that feel of the water. One of the things I like most about having a water feature is that it brings in the insects and the wildlife. And so that, getting back to connecting with nature, can be very relaxing. And so putting a seat by a water feature, and then listening to the water and watching and listening for the insects. At the Galileo Sensory Garden, I put a lot of flowers like salvia, for instance, near the water feature. And so you could hear the little burble of the water, and then you could hear the bees. And then I had some of the long tube flowers. And so then at certain times of year, the hummingbirds would appear. And so in just a little garden with a little bench, and it wasn't particularly comfortable, it doesn't have to be comfortable to be relaxing, I and the students could just sit and listen to the water, listen to the bees, listen to the hummingbirds, and those are moments that will stay with me forever as I think about the gardening, because it is something that is just so calming and so relaxing that it creates an amazing memory. Christine saying, my spot is sitting on my swing in my gazebo. Awesome. I have a water fountain and I watch birds taking baths. Oh, absolutely. I have grapevines growing up the gazebo and leaves are big. It's a private space, yet being open. So there you go again. And so when I start talking about having your private space, yes, it doesn't need to be closed up. It could be if you want to build a high hedge so that you have a secluded private spot, no one can see you and you can't see anyone else, go for it. That is absolutely a private spot. But a private spot can also be open, and you can watch the birds and be shaded by the leaves, maybe be sheltered, maybe be a little secluded. That's definitely something that you can build into your design plan and then take advantage of it. It's personalized. And so these suggestions and what others will be suggesting today as well, these are all our own personal preferences when we talk about the calming effect of the garden and what we find relaxing in the garden. And so don't feel that if you're not doing it, you're doing something wrong. Not at all. The idea is more, take some of these ideas, maybe mold them, maybe make them more personal for you, and then you develop some of these things in the garden. Greg says, for me, more important than a space is a mindset. Good idea. Good thought, Greg. For example, I have to accept that I'm going to lose a certain percentage of the harvest to bugs, animals, and laziness. Absolutely. I love this idea. This is wonderful, Greg. And I was just thinking about this over the weekend. I've got so many cucumbers on the vine right now that I haven't harvested. Some of it is from laziness. Some of it is because I just got so many other cucumbers that are already in the kitchen. And it really didn't bother me that I've got cucumbers that are going to end up in the compost pile, or that the dogs are going to eat, or that I'm going to leave for the birds to peck through. It didn't bother me at all because, like you, I accept that a certain percentage of what I grow is just not going to be used by me. I've given my neighbors a bunch of stuff this year, and it reaches a point where it's like you don't want to overload them, just like you don't want to overload yourself. And it's okay. It's okay if some of your harvests go straight into the compost pile. I accept that. That is also, like Greg, part of my plan, that they're going to be lost to the bugs or the animals anyway. And if one of those animals is me because I just was too lazy to harvest, I accept that. And that's okay. So don't feel undue pressure that you're supposed to perform to a certain level in gardening. First off, we are our own worst critics. And then I think many of us feel like there's this unseen advisor, unseen observer that is going to tell us that we're doing something wrong. And there's nobody there. It's just you. It's just your own mind. And you're convincing yourself that maybe something isn't as good as it could be. Just accept it. Accept that loss, and you'll be calmer and more relaxed. Robin Garden says, I find deadheading relaxing. Sure. I take my chair and sit comfortably and do the job. It's always rewards at the end, all cleaned up. I stop and just take it in for a few minutes and move on. Love that idea. As I was walking through the garden today. It was too cold this morning to actually do some watering. The hose was slightly frozen and pretty stiff, so I've got to wait for it to thaw out to do some watering a little later today. But as I was walking past my raspberry patch, I was having kind of the same thought. I usually save cleaning up my raspberry bed till a little bit later in the year, but hopefully I'll be harvesting raspberries very, very soon, and then it'll be time to clean up that bed. And so this year, that area in particular, maybe a few other areas, I'm going to do exactly this. I'm just going to choose a day and go out and just deadhead, cut and drop, chop and drop, clean up, however you want to call it. The idea is just to clean up that space so that going into the winter, that's one less thing I have to do next year. And that's one of those things about relaxation as well, is sometimes it takes work to relax, but the amount of relaxation time hopefully is way more than the amount of time, the amount of effort that it took to get to that point. So in this case, be it deadheading, you've got to clean up your garden at some point. Why not just go ahead and do it and make it a relaxing moment? Take your chair, take your stool, and just get close with those plants. And like for me, cleaning up my raspberries, I'm not going to make it a chore. It's going to be a nice, regular, systematic activity. I'll be cutting down all those canes. But next year, in early spring, as I'm getting the rest of my garden cleaned up, I can look at that raspberry patch and say, oh, I feel good about that. It's already done. There's no stress at all for the next 6 months when it comes to my raspberry patch. I kind of like that idea. So what is it that you do that helps out? Greg says bird feeders too. I have them throughout the garden. Yeah, bird feeders, bird houses, leaving your plants up, absolutely ways to bring all that life in. Heidi says, my asparagus plants are a ladybug factory. There are so many on the plantation eating the asparagus aphids. There you go. I could just, like I said, I can just spend a lot of time looking at those ladybugs and really take advantage of it. Serena says, I may not have to water for a few days. At 10 last night on the news, they said we got 4.79 inches of rain, and it didn't start till around 1 p.m. We have 20%, 40% rain chances for the next 2 days. Cool. Yeah, I didn't have to water yesterday. I had rain on Saturday, and when I go out today, I may only have to water a little bit. I had to cover some of my beds because the temperature was dropping so cold, and so I'll have to water those beds because they've been covered for a couple of days. But I'm thinking the same thing, and so that's one of those ways to find relaxation in the garden is those chores. If you see watering as a chore, those kind of activities that you've had to do on a regular basis, day in and day out over the course of the growing season, and then something as nice as rain comes, go out and just spend the same time in the garden that you would have spent watering, but instead just don't water because you don't need to, and instead do something different, like the bugs, the birds, the sounds, whatever it happens to be. And that way you can still have your garden time, but now it is definitely devoted relaxation time. Tanya's Townhouse Garden says, good morning, and good morning to you. I too love the birds, which I've never seen up close, just frolicking on my sunflowers. I just always see the work and start to work. I have a hard time just relaxing. So there you go. And so this is the time of year for those of us where our season is beginning to wane, where we don't have to water as much when we clean up a bed. So therefore that we don't need to worry about that bed for months to come. Just get out there. All of that work that you've been doing in your garden, turn into relaxation. It's the same amount of time. You're not really adjusting your schedule. You're just modifying what it is that you do with your schedule. Riverdale Gardens, always nice when you can join us on a Monday. We acquired chickens for the first time this spring. Cool. Watching them scratch around with a morning coffee has been quite therapeutic. I like that idea. Yeah, just watching the animals. That's why I talk about my my animals now. Mala has been a relatively laid back dog, and we'll go out to the garden. But now with the puppy Lika, when they're out together, it's a lot more active, and I can just sit or stand and watch them play, and I find that relaxing. And definitely with the chickens, when I had chickens years ago, I would do the same thing. I would just stand. I was usually working around the coop, and when I would just not really force myself, but make a point to stop and just watch the chickens because they really can be a lot of fun. Shandy's Garden says, sitting on my large, fluffy yoga mat, only for gardening. Cool. Picking hundreds of my micro spoon tomatoes that volunteered this year. It's absolutely massive, but so satisfying. I love that idea. Mike W says, I have a porch swing in the shade looking at the garden. My covered back porch looks over the garden as well. A swing, I don't have a swing yet. I've been planning to build a swing for a long time, and I think I know where I'm going to put it. So I've been delaying building it because I wasn't sure where I would put it. I think I have an idea, but I like that idea. Just sitting on a swinging in the garden or on the porch or any place else so that you can observe the garden is absolutely a wonderful way to take some time out of your day. Gina says everyone has room for a sealed bottom pot with water and a little solar fountain. So calming. Yeah, that's what I've been doing in the last few years. And the videos that I show is just those little solar fountains can make such a big difference in having a water feature and not having a water feature. It's so easy to do. You just fill a container with water and put one of those solar fountains in it, and now you've got the sound of running water, and you can see it, and you can see all the insects and everything else that comes in. But Tina says, I go out to do one thing, end up touring the entire garden, checking in on all my babies. Love to just stroll from bed to bed, admiring the flowers tucked in everywhere, looking for bees, frogs. Cool. Yeah, that's the way to do it. And when I found a toad this year for the first time. When you can find those kind of things in the garden, first off, I just am amazed, and then I started taking pictures, and then every day I go back looking for it. I only saw the toad on one day. He's out there somewhere, but just the idea that there's life in the garden can be very, very calming. Dan says, I grow cinnamon basil, mostly for the scent. And I grow a lot of plants like that. My mint, for instance, I do use mint in cooking and in beverages, but I also like to just run my hand across the mint. I have the mint in one of the primary pathways of my garden. And so it's easy. I don't do it often enough, but when you just run your hand across something like that, one of those fragrant mints or lavender is another great plant to do that too. It just sends that burst of aroma that really, really can be a lot of fun and calming, since that's what we're talking about today. There's Jay, of course, on top of things with a link to one of my videos. And I do have a number of them. It's a way to try to get out in the garden. There's another one, the bubbler fountain. I really like that bubbler fountain. Didn't have the same sound. I built it in a couple different tiers, and so it was the sound of the water falling from one level to the next level, and it was a little bit different than some of those other fountains that I've had. So I do different kinds of fountains. There's another one. Thank you for doing that, Jay. I do appreciate it. Ron, Jan, and Arthur. My front porch is just perfect. It's a very private and cozy for being a front porch. I have a lamp on a dresser that we use to store outdoor blankets and gardening books. We have wicker and cushions. Oh, that's wonderful. And so if you haven't done it, and I get questions all the time, or comments, I should say, because I make videos around the year. And here in Colorado, it gets pretty cold during the winter, and it can stay pretty cold in the winter. And so I this year in particular, when I've made some of those winter videos, I'll comment on what the temperature is. And inevitably there are comments about how that's too cold, or how can you be out there? Well, when we have that calm, when we have that feeling, it tends to warm us up. Calming seems to just warm our whole body. And so when I go out in the garden in winter and it is cold and maybe it's snowy and everybody else is inside, they're doing something other than standing in the garden. So it is a private location, even in the middle of my garden where everyone can see it. Still those private moments in the garden in the middle of winter. And it's that personal feeling that I'm in my garden in December or January and it's frigid outside, but that calming, that relaxation that I feel every time I go to the garden, it does warm me up. I mean, it may not be a physical sensation of warmth, but at least it's a mental sensation of warmth. And I can actually stand in my garden on the coldest days and not really feel the cold because I can still see some of those birds maybe that are hanging out around in the wintertime. I can still listen for maybe the wind blowing. And then I can also just feel the calm. Maybe there's no sound at all except my walking through the garden on the crunching snow. That kind of thing. For those of us who live in very cold regions, and unless you've experienced that, I know like with skiing sometimes and other winter sports, you can get that calm. You can get that feeling when you're just kind of one with the activity and you're one with nature. And it is something that just counteracts the cold. So if you haven't done that before and you live in an environment like that, get out and do it. You might realize that you kind of like going into the garden in winter. Big Will Dog, I'm counting the days I have left to pick strawberries and sit on my swinging chair while I eat them. Peaceful afternoons, just me and my two dogs. Enough said. What could be better than that? And yeah, I'm counting those days too. I love going out every day and picking strawberries and hanging out in the garden with my two dogs as well. That's absolutely a fantastic way. And then there's that other video from Jay. Thank you. I have on how to do a water fountain to actually entice some of that wildlife into your garden. So have fun with it. Floyd says, would your hammock fit between the post of your pergola? If you mounted between the north post, it would be on the shade. So yes, that was actually my original plan. So when I first designed the garden, I was planning to do that with a hammock on the north side of those posts, or the north side between those two posts. But as I started actually building out the garden, I modified my plan a little bit. And so now that central part of my garden actually leads into different rooms, different gardens. And so that room, that garden to the north, I was going to have a different entrance, which is why that spot was going to work for a hammock. But now my current plan is to make that whole garden space right in front of my greenhouse a private garden, a secret garden with only one entrance. And that entrance will be from that central location. And so with that in mind now, the hammock really doesn't work. And so as I said earlier, right, I've got an idea now. I think that private secret garden is where I'm going to put my hammock. It'll be a spot that you really can't see from outside very well, and I'll be able to look out a little bit, and I can go in there and be secluded completely. And I'll have a water feature as the central spot of that garden area. And then off to the side, I'm not sure which side, but probably on the east side, because it might be shaded a tad more, a hammock for relaxing. And then on the opposite side, a bench for sitting. So you'll see that in future videos because I've been developing the idea for that garden for a long time now. And as it's finally getting close to being built, all of these things are starting to come together. So the nice thing about gardening, I highly recommend the plan and trying to follow the plan, especially when you're doing a major garden build like I've been doing for 5 years. it can be modified as you start changing something in one area, maybe it changes something in another area. So the basic plan, the basic structure is still pretty much the same as I originally conceived it 5 years ago. But the specifics of the plants and the benches and maybe a hammock and the water features, those are all the things that you may not have figured out when you do your initial plan. And so as you highlight those areas in your garden and do it, this is one of those things about hand watering, about walking through your garden, about standing or sitting in your garden and watching the dogs or watching the birds or listening to the water. You'll find those energy locations. I really do believe, I can't explain it. Most of it is certainly mental, but there are those locations in your garden that do give you a burst of energy or do calm you or whatever other emotions or feelings that you have in the garden. There are very specific locations that for whatever reason highlight those sensations. So find those spots. And that's why I kind of had to wait until I built my garden to then figure out these extras, these things that you add to the garden setting to make it more beneficial internally, mentally, even physically. These are the kind of things that you may not have thought about. So get out in your garden and think about it. Try to figure out what you're going to do and then do it. Hi, Anna from northern Sweden. We have had our 2 first frosts, so I'm mostly out when picking large bunches of flowers or veggies. Yeah, it's that time of year. It was so close. So my plants did okay, but when I was walking through my fruit garden, the trees and the bushes, it took me a moment. So we had rain over the last couple of days, and I was walking with the dogs in the far back of my garden area, and the mulch was all white. And I thought, well, that's odd. I know I've got different fungi growing in and around the mulch because it's been there for a few years now, and we had rain. And that was my initial thought, is that it was the fungus that was showing up on the surface, like mycelial threads. And then as I got a little bit closer, I realized, no, it was actually frost. The surface of my wood chip wet mulch had some frost on it, a low spot in the garden. My raised beds that sit a couple feet higher than that didn't get the frost. It was just that low lying, wet, woody area. So technically, I haven't had a frost, but there were definitely frosty conditions. So we are encountering that. And especially in northern Sweden, I have no doubt that your cold is on the way. Hopefully, it can stay a little bit warm so you can get out and finish picking your flowers and your veggies. That's what I'm hoping for, is that we still have enough time to be able to get out in the garden and get some of that stuff out there. And so I'd be interested, Anna, and if you'd comment, and for those of you in Norway as well, how do you look at gardening in winter? All of the Scandinavian countries have winter, and it's pretty long and pretty cold and pretty dark. And so how do you approach your winter? Like I said, here in the mountains of Colorado at 7,000 feet elevation, I'm still out in my garden on almost a daily basis, unless it's really too severe, because that garden feeling just really helps me throughout the day. So for those of you who do have the cold, what do? Do you sit out there? I don't typically bundle up and sit in the garden, though I have on occasion. I prefer to bundle up and stand and walk through the garden and observe the differences between when things were growing and now they're in the cold, there's nothing. So it's these kind of ideas, I think, that maybe we can share with each other and get some ideas for doing things in the garden that we might not have otherwise done. Hi, Tony. Simplified Gardening is with us. Jay has linked to this video of mine. Gardening can save your life, literally. And so in that video, I talk about some of these effects that the garden can give to you. That just being in the garden, working in the garden, standing in the garden, spending time in the garden, they can truly, I mean, studies have shown this, truly help your mental well-being. And during the winter, there are many people that are affected by the lack of sun, by the darkness, and they don't necessarily, or maybe until now, have not thought that the garden can be a solution. It's just so easy to get depressed in winter when maybe bundling up and going outside and standing in the cold is a little stimulating, that cold, but also, even if nothing's growing, you can still get the benefits of being in the garden. Science says, I love relaxing by snacking on my harvest while I work in the garden. Oh, so true. I'll often pick a tomato, pepper, grape, berry, etc. every few minutes to snack on and remind myself how good this hard work tastes. Yes. And I love that. Hard work tastes good. Absolutely. And that by itself should be a reason why you should grow a garden, that you can eat some of the things, because you're working hard. And yes, hard work tastes good. I like that. That's really a nice way to say it. Dusty Flat says the bluebirds and wrens were fun to watch earlier, and now cardinals and finches taking care of sunflowers. Cool. Yeah, and that's another thing. When you start looking at the insects or looking at the birds, you'll notice they change. Typically, you're going to have different birds at different times of year. You're definitely going to have, or you're going to have different insects at different times of the year. And so make note of that, because it's not like every time you go to the garden, it's the same thing happening and you're going to get bored with it. No, when you do it regularly, you're actually going to see that the boredom disappears, because there's so much new and so much different. Linda McLeod, Scotland this year, we watched the weather forecast and tried to plan relaxing time in the garden, but a chair in the greenhouse helps. Yes. And, Eli and Kate, my wonderful friends from Scotland as well, they've got their outdoor sitting spot, but then, of course, there's the greenhouse. And Eli and I have had a number of conversations along these lines about what a greenhouse is best used for. And in Scotland, often the greenhouse is where you do most of your gardening. And therefore, that's a wonderful spot to go and enjoy the garden when outside it is cold and drizzly and not so much fun. Nothing wrong with highlighting the greenhouse as a good place to stand. And that's, I've talked about this in a couple of videos, and I've mentioned it in a few of the live streams. The greenhouse, my greenhouse, has just turned out so much better than I anticipated. I thought it was just going to be a place that I could grow plants in spring that I couldn't grow outside because it's too cold, or plants I could grow through the summer and into the winter because I just couldn't have a longer season outside. And it is that. But what I found is exactly this: just being in the greenhouse when the weather is raging outside, or maybe it's so cold outside, or maybe it's just gray and dreary outside. The greenhouse is nice and warm. And especially while plants are growing longer in the greenhouse, it just still becomes one of those points that gives me energy, that just really is good for my mental well-being. And so I love my greenhouse, and I spend as much time in there as I can throughout the summer and also into the colder months. Last year, being able to walk into the greenhouse in November and harvest tomatoes and eat them right then when everything outside was brown and dead or dormant and it was cold, you just have to do that. until you've had a tomato inside a greenhouse when the outside world is kind of sad and dreary. You're not sad and dreary at all. So I love my greenhouse. It really has been one of the best decisions I made. Took me many, many, many years to get to the point to have a greenhouse. And now it's like I should have added more to the budget earlier so that I could have had a greenhouse sooner. And maybe that would make a difference. Dale R978 says, is there a reason why I should not plant garlic and tulip bulbs in the same grow bag? Never grown tulips before. I don't know of a reason why you shouldn't, as long as they're separate from each other so that they're not going to interfere as they grow. There aren't any diseases or pests that one will bring to the other that I'm aware of, and it's a nice way to have like the tulips that will flower for a brief period of time and then fade. And then about that time, the garlic's going to be appearing. So you'll have more plants growing in that bed. The probably the only concern that pops to my head is that you're going to have to harvest the garlic. And so by pulling out those garlic bulbs, you might interfere with the tulips. You might cause some damage to the tulips in the process of harvesting the garlic if you were intending on keeping tulips in that same grow bag for the next year. But if you were going to harvest the tulip bulbs for planting in a different location in the fall, sure, go for it. Llama, thank you. That's on my list as well. I just recently added wind chimes to my garden. I never thought I'd like wind chimes, but there is something very soothing about hearing them. I have wind chimes hanging from the center of my gazebo, and I love it. I have the longer, thicker chimes, so it's a deeper resonating sound. I love that. I like the tinkle, the higher pitched wind chimes as well, but I prefer those lower bass-like tones. And yes, absolutely. So when I was talking earlier about the sound in the garden, of the sensory garden, the sound of the water and the insects, in my center point, my primary calm location, I've got wind chimes. Absolutely. And I actually have some, we had a doorbell at my last house, and they're like 3-foot and 4-foot long tubes, and very classic doorbell ding dong kind of sound, also that lower resonance. We did a remodel, took out that doorbell, put in a different one, but I've saved those tubes because in that new section, I've been trying to figure out where to put them, but that new section I was telling you about where I might have a hammock, I'm definitely putting a water feature. I'm thinking about putting those long tubes as just a really robust wind chime in that protected area. So I love wind chimes. Absolutely. Jan Zeely says, at the moment here, we are having a drought. So when it started raining yesterday, it was more than relaxing. Great idea. Yeah, just a change in the weather can be one of those things, like Serena was talking about the rain as well. Take advantage of that. Yes, absolutely. The rain, for those of you maybe in Scotland, and I know Wales has had some many, many rainy days this year as well. Yes, over and over and over, day by day by day, the rain may not be as calming as it had started. But for the rest of us who live in drought areas, yeah, I'll go outside and stand in the rain. And my dogs as well. Both of my dogs, they don't mind standing in the rain. So I'll go out with them on some of those days when it just starts to rain. This gets back to the aromas of the garden as well. You've noticed it. There is a change in the way that the garden smells from when it's been dry to now it's suddenly wet. It's a totally different garden. Do that. Go out in the rain and just smell the rain and smell your garden. And that's one of those those sensations that if you really highlight, it can stick with you. So now in the future, you're in your garden and it's not raining, maybe you can relive some of those moments, some of those aromas to really take advantage of what has happened in the garden. And I really like that idea too. Sometimes the memories that we've created in our garden can also bring the joy and the relaxation. It's, the moments that my grandkids were in the garden harvesting pumpkins. And so I've got pumpkins on the vine. Some of them are ready to harvest, some of them are close to harvest. And I'll be standing there watering and thinking about how good it's going to be, how great it's going to be when my grandkids come in a few weeks and harvest those pumpkins. And I just stand back and enjoy it. It's those kind of moments that later on I can be in the garden standing by the pumpkin patch, and some of those emotions arise again. Jen is saying, my biggest obstacle to relaxing in the garden is mosquitoes. I'm one of those people they find especially tasty. It makes the sight of dragonflies extremely satisfying and calming. Good for you. Yeah, I have one of those too. The mosquitoes, the flies, they'll swarm me and leave everybody else alone. And I encourage those predators like you're talking about, the insect predators, the birds, bats, whatever you can get to deal with mosquitoes in particular. Absolutely. And that's why a water feature should be a running water feature. If you have stagnant water, you're just encouraging the mosquitoes to multiply in your garden. So have the water feature, but have the running water feature. And then look at a dragonfly as a calming factor in your garden. And it's because they're dealing with that factor that is taking away from some of that satisfaction that you're enjoying. So there's always something. And like I said, the garden is personalized. We're the ones that know what we like and what calms us. And that's the kind of stuff that you can focus on in your garden, is identifying those kind of things. Shandy's Garden says, love watching my solid white pet bunny rabbit Blinky jump all over and munch on things. She never eats much, and I protect new seedlings. Cool. I've done that. I've mentioned that, excuse me, in the past. The rabbits I have, I like watching them munch away, especially because, at least in my yard, they're munching away on the weeds that I allow to grow around my beds. They're not getting in the beds. They're not eating my plants. They're eating the weeds. In my backyard, my primary garden spots don't have much of rabbits these days. Mala has done a pretty good job keeping them away. But in the front yard, where the dogs don't go, every morning there are rabbits munching. And yeah, just watching them munch on things. Their little rabbit mouths. There's something about that is calming. As long as they're not eating the plants that are going to stress you out, watch the rabbits. Ruth Ann says, I stroll my garden as my coffee is brewing now with sweater and slippers. Yeah, as it cools, saying goodbye to my now weary and tired garden. I hope you don't break that pattern, even when the garden is more weary and tired. Still go out in the garden while your coffee is brewing and still enjoy it. Enjoy that time as the garden is changing, and it can really help you through, because it helps me through those dark months by getting out in the garden and being able to see some of the stuff that is happening out there. So, okay, I'm just gonna try to scroll through here quickly. I know I'm about 20 minutes behind in the comments, so I'll try to get a little bit closer to where you all are in your comments as I'm talking. That way, maybe what I'm saying will be a little more practical. Sari Lou says, we can get a frost in early October or as late as mid-November in Indiana. Yeah, there's, those of us in the central part of the United States, generally, it's coming. For me, officially, it's the first week of October is my first frost. So I'm within 2 weeks of the historical frost happening in my garden, which is why I'm getting out there every opportunity I get now while it's warm, so that I can save some of those memories and at least enjoy the warmth in the garden a little bit longer than when I was out in the garden last winter, and I'll be in the garden this next winter. Deck Roar says, here at the Norwegian West Coast, winter can be cold and wet and will freeze over many times during the winter. Most of my winter gardening goes on in my head. There you go. Lots of time for planning and dreaming. Yeah, absolutely. I've mentioned this so many times in my planning videos that's something that helps me get through the winter as well, is that planning. And so I spent a lot of time in the winter months planning and dreaming, and that's usually the catalyst that takes me outside when I'm thinking about what I'm going to grow. In fact, this year, one of my videos at the beginning of this year talks about that, planning the garden in winter. And I'm actually standing outside on a very cold day, looking at my beds and planning what's going to go in those beds. Then I go inside where it's warm and start looking at the seed catalogs and start thinking about the future days, how those plants that I see in a catalog, and then go through the process of getting the seeds and then maybe starting the seeds and planning where they're going to go and then putting them in the ground. I mean, that's a months long process. But dreaming of what they're going to look like when it's finally done, yeah, the calming can be indoors. Absolutely. Myra's asking, just started seeds for winter garden in Florida using peat pellets. Should I remove plants from pellets when transplanting? So it depends on the plant and the root development. Generally, the peat pellets, those little pots, the pellets turn into like a pot location. Generally, those are intended to put the whole thing into the soil, and then the roots will pop out from there. But a number of the peat pellets I've used have that mesh around it. So it's a compressed pellet of peat, and it has that little mesh, and then you put it in the water and it expands into a little mini pot that you can start your seeds in. You can put those directly in the ground, but that mesh really doesn't break down. And while the roots can grow through it, like I said, it depends on the root development. So for those mesh pellets or those mesh covered peat pellets, I will either take my knife and just do slits and pull off the mesh, or at the very least cut out the bottom of the mesh so that the roots can go someplace and not be hindered by that mesh. But there are different kinds of peat pellets, and it's really those that have that barrier to the small roots that I remove. But I don't remove the actual peat. I still keep the roots intact around the peat and then put all that in. It's just the mesh that I occasionally, and it depends on the plant, but occasionally I'll pull those off when I put it in the ground. And so I almost always have my utility knife with me when I'm in the garden working. And so it's not that big a deal to go ahead and pull it off and make some of those changes to, I think, whatever the designer of the peat pellet intended. Supposedly they're going to break down, but I've found some of those mesh covered pellets the next year with really no sign that they were breaking down at all. So yeah, gardens happen, absolutely right. The smell from the rain is from the soil bacteria. And depending on when the rain happens, it's actually, like for me with the thunderstorms, you can have the ozone in the air that is added to the bacteria. And then of course, if you've got a lot of organic material in your soil, that rain that reaches that decaying or slightly decaying material caused by the bacteria really adds to the aromas as well. So the rain has different aromas at different times, depending on whether it's a light rain or heavy rain, and whether it's a new wetness or old wetness. There's a lot of things like that can make a difference. So spend a lot of time on wet days and notice those differences. Jimmy's saying, my garden is wrapped around my pool, I popped the return spout up so the water splash is louder. Ooh, interesting idea. There you go. Yeah, absolutely. Plan your water so that you get the sound of the water that you're really looking for. And that really can be a lot of fun. So that's why I say when you plan your garden and you build your garden, there's no reason why you can't modify it at any point to fit whatever it is that you want to fit. Robin's asking, what seeds should not be saved? I learned my lesson on squash, but any other tips for saving seeds? So it comes down to why you're saving seeds. So I have a video that I did on land race gardening, and you can save any seed and plant any seed, even squash. The issue with the squash seeds is that most of us are growing with the intent that we want to save the seeds to grow the same plant again. But if you're willing to experiment a little bit, roll the dice, you can save those squash seeds and plant those squash seeds. It's going to be some kind of hybrid, because if you are doing multiple squashes, they will cross pollinate. And so the resulting plant next year is not going to be the same. So you can still save those seeds. You're just not going to get the same plant. Generally, we're saving the seeds from the tomatoes, the peppers, the beans, the plants that are going to grow the same next year, that have a remote possibility of being cross-pollinated. But if you want to save those squashes, you can still save those squashes. You just have to plan for it. If you plan so that you have some of your squash going in early in the season, those plants, one variety of a zucchini, those plants will flower and fruit, and you can save those seeds because there's nothing else out there to cross-pollinate with that zucchini. And then plan a different squash later in the season so that when those plants start growing and start flowering, either the zucchini are done or you rip out the zucchini. And now you save the seeds from that second crop. So that's a tip if you want to save squash seeds. But for anything that's going to be cross-pollinated, you just kind of have to accept that if you save the seeds, you're going to get a hybrid. Or you plan a sequenced planting. You can also put row cover netting over those plants. They will require pollinators. So it might be one of those things that you have to do hand pollination, and you can still get fruit with hand pollination. I've got a video on how to hand pollinate pumpkins. It can still be done, but you keep those beds totally covered so no other pollinator comes in, and you can save the seeds of those plants. So there's lots of things you can do. It just takes planning and some preparation and maybe a little bit extra effort. So let me go ahead and talk about the background today. This background comes from Carla Garner, and she sent this to me as a calming garden. And so I haven't really talked about this part of it. We've been talking about getting out in the garden during the day, but how often do you get out to the garden at night to enjoy your garden space? And so this shows a number of the flowers and the plants that she has along her fence with the lights to highlight those plants. And then, of course, just over my shoulder, she's taking this from her sitting area with a chair, especially during the summer months and even spring and fall when the nights are warm enough. You can get out in your garden when the sun isn't shining. And it's a completely different experience. You're still going to have insects, but one of the key differences that I think is fascinating in the nighttime garden, you're going to see moths. During the sun, it's the butterflies. During the moon, it's the moths. And the moths, particularly if you see some of those sphinx moths or those gypsy moths, the big moths, they're like little hummingbirds. They feed the same way. And to sit in a nighttime garden and observe some of those insects that you may have never seen before, oh, it really is fascinating. And then the shadows on the plants and the colors of the plants, particularly at moonlight. There are a number of plants, usually white flowered or very light colored flowers, that will open at night. So consider planting a moonlight garden that really is intended to enjoy outside at night under the moonlight. Something that if you haven't experienced it, you really don't know what you're missing. And it doesn't take that much effort. You don't have to grow those kind of plants to enjoy a moonlit garden, but just get outside and walk through it. I've done that a lot. Usually, many nights we do that as I'm taking the dogs out for the last time. They can go out by themselves, but I like walking out with them to see what's happening in the garden at night. That's when I see the bats eating the mosquitoes. That's when I see some of those moths that are coming through. Occasionally, I'll see one of those nocturnal animals. You might see a possum or a raccoon. You might, like I have in my area, see deer that you wouldn't necessarily see during the day. They're a little more active at night, walking through the garden area. Not always a good thing if they like to munch on the plants, but watching that deer stand by the tree staring at you in the moonlight, it's that connection with nature that is so important throughout the garden setting. So think about that. Take advantage of different times of day that you're getting out in the garden. And absolutely, the nighttime can be one of those. And so Carla's got a nice grass lawn. Walking through the grass barefoot when it's cool at night, and you can still smell the flowers and maybe hear those bats or moths or the coyotes howling in the background like I often hear. It adds a new calming influence to your garden. And it creates some of those memories. So now in the daytime, when you're standing on one of those energy spots, maybe it was one of your nighttime energy spots, and you can stand on it in the daytime and kind of relive and remember some of those nighttime moments and still get that energy boost. So thank you for the suggestion, Carla, and thank you for sending this picture. I think it is a topic that we don't spend enough time thinking about. And if you think about it enough to start making it more of a habit, then you don't have to think about it. You just go out to the garden, and it just is one of those things that it's a happy place. Llama Llama says, I love daydreaming about the next growing season during winter, finding recipes for crops I'll be growing and drawing out my plans. No winter blues when garden planning. Completely agree. John June has had some of the most enjoyment watching wrens with young, extremely busy going amongst my tomato row and filling their beaks with insects. Yeah, I've tried to film some of that for my Instagram and haven't really gotten away with it. But yeah, I like just standing and watching my birds fly back and forth to the bird houses to feed the young. And usually when I get too close, of course, the adults aren't coming anymore, but you can hear those young, hungry birds. It's like, where'd mom and dad go? I'm hungry. And it is just utter enjoyment watching the birds in the garden and what they do back and forth. Okay, let's see. I think I'm much closer now. Yeah, I'm just a few minutes behind. There's the link that Shay sent about my landrace gardening. Thank you for that. Shandy's Garden says, if you've got hummingbird feeders out right now, please make sure to refresh the nectar because we've got passing through hummers migrating south. Yeah, absolutely. You should always have the fresh supply of the sugar water for those birds. I this year and last year, and I think some people might look at it as a problem. I didn't, because it was one of those new things that was not typical that I had seen before. So had my hummingbird feeder up, fresh sugar water in it, and I had it up before the hummingbirds appeared, and I had them up after the hummingbirds disappeared, just in case there were some stragglers in migration. But they were covered by bees and wasps, and even other birds were landing on the hummingbird feeder to get some of that sweet nectar. And so when the hummingbirds were active, they did a pretty good job of keeping some of those other things away. But during those inactive periods when there weren't the hummingbirds, there was still a lot of life feeding on that sugar water. And I was just amazed when I was seeing sparrows land on my hummingbird feeder. I'd never seen that before. So there's always something new to see in the garden if you get out there and if you take the time to do that. Aaron's asking, wondering if you have any tips for what nutrients on growing carrots in grow bags during the fall season. Would love to have a live video on growing carrots. They're tricky to grow. So carrots, since we're trying to grow them as a root crop, the key as far as the nutrients are concerned is to limit the nitrogen and try to increase the phosphorus and potassium when you talk about the NPK. But also don't discount the other macronutrients. Make sure you're using something to put the magnesium and the sulfur and the calcium into the soil as well. All plants need those kind of things. But it's really limiting the nitrogen. The nitrogen is one of those things that in a lot of our potting mixes that we buy, it's not a high nitrogen component, but if it's got added fertilizer, it's going to have nitrogen in it. So avoid adding more nitrogen because then your carrots are going to get big bushy tops and you're not going to get the roots. You need to focus on all those other elemental nutrients when you're growing in a grow bag. So I'm not planning a video on that. I am planning on growing, or I've been planning a video, almost did it this year, maybe next year, on growing carrots in 5-gallon buckets. So when I get to that video, I'll plan to talk more about the nutrients, particularly if you're growing them during the fall season, because they can be tough. I've got carrots for my fall garden in my raised beds right now, and I started those 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, and they've got at least another month to go. They can handle some cold. It's going to be fine. One of the best carrot crops I've had in a long time. And it's because I spent the extra attention to the soil to be able to get them growing. So it's all about the soil to really make a difference with those plants that are harder. Carla's saying, I love to look out on this scene in the snow time. Oh, I bet. I choose my houses with large windows out into the garden. I have to be able to see out all year. So this is a great point, Carla. And absolutely, and I like the big windows to look out on my garden as well. And I also have chosen houses with big windows. Or if they didn't have a big window like the last house, we ended up doing a remodel and put the big windows in to look out. When you're designing your garden, most of our attention is we're standing in the garden, we're sitting in the garden, we're planting in the garden, and that's the focus of our plan. Particularly my front yard, my main landscape garden, I planned that with the intent of what will it look like when I look out my front window? Yes, I want it to look good for neighbors and people walking by or driving by. But if I'm going to build it, I want to enjoy it. So the placement of my bushes, the placement of my daylilies, all the other plants, it's for me. So like my daylilies, for instance, I have big currant bushes in my front yard as a landscape plant. The daylilies actually are between the currants and the house. So when I look out the window, I can see the daylilies in bloom. For someone driving by, they might not be able to see those daylilies. They see the currant bushes and it blocks the view. That's okay because it's my garden and I want to look at it. And I design my space like the front with the bushes, with some of the hardscape items, because of the snow and how it's going to look when I am standing in front of my window looking at that fresh fallen snow on my yard. So absolutely great idea to plan a garden and to also look out the window to see what the garden looks like, especially in winter, especially when it's warmer. You can look out and just enjoy it. Tony's saying the outside at night in the garden is very relaxing. There you go. It is. It's an opportunity. If you like the moon, if you like the stars, uh, and so that's why I was talking about putting different sitting areas, different benches, hammocks, things like that in different areas of the garden. So my central sitting space is the gazebo. It's covered. It's so I can have some shade during the day. It's not my sitting or standing spot at night because you really can't see the stars from that location. So instead, have a second sitting area that is exposed to the stars. And if you've ever gone camping and you're sitting out, especially after the fire's gone out, and you are lying in your sleeping bag staring at the stars, is there anything more peaceful than that? So, why wouldn't you want to create something along those lines in your own garden where you can be surrounded by all of the things you've put in and stare at the stars and just be, like Tony says, very relaxed by putting all those kind of things in? Mobius is saying moon garden, plant silver, gray, green colored plants. Yes, it's not the, the way our eyes work with colors, the rods and the cones. We're not picking up the oranges and the reds and the flower colors at night. A lot of it is the foliage. It's when I go out in my front yard in particular, where I was talking about the lamb's ear with that gray fuzzy leaf looks totally different at night than it does during the daytime. So great suggestion. And in planting the colors that you really want to put in. Outlier Gardner says, just wanted to say thanks for another inspiring live stream. Well, you're very welcome. Well, I have a connection, spotty internet today. I hope it stays with you until we can get to the end. So you don't have to watch on replay, but you can also watch on a replay if you miss it, of course. Everyone can do that at any time. Lawrence says, I go out at night sometimes with a flashlight to check for caterpillars, slugs, and other pests. Also carry a bottle of BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. So yeah, that's another thing. So go out with your flashlight at night, absolutely. And things will pop up that you might not normally be able to see during the day. Go out with a black light at night. You can get black light flashlights. Totally different world. But the tobacco hornworm on tomatoes, you almost never can find the hornworm on your tomatoes during the day, but you can see them at night. So there's a lot of those kind of pests that if you can identify the damage, the pest might be easier to catch and trap the caterpillars, the slugs, other pests at night. And it doesn't need to be midnight. As soon as it starts getting dark, they'll come out. Or go out in early morning. That's also a really good time before the sun has come up. Particularly as the days are changing, the days are shorter if you haven't noticed, and they're getting shorter still. We're getting up at the same time. And so those days when we go out and the sun was up are now the days that we're going out and the sun has yet to come up. If you got dogs that you're taking outside, use that opportunity to get outside and enjoy an early morning garden. It's a totally different experience. And Sari Lou says, when I had peach trees and no dog, I'd have raccoons waking me up. That's interesting. There's that part of nature. Raccoons can be noisy. So that's funny that you say that. Dwayne says gardening is good for the senses too. Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to try to scroll up as we get closer to the end so we can be closer to real time. I apologize if I've missed something that might have popped up in just, or that you might have asked in just the last few minutes. Down low, music says, I see so many slugs during the day. I would hate to see more. I tossed 9 over the fence yesterday when I took out my tomato plants. So, yeah, if you've got a lot of slugs, especially if you're in a rainy environment with lots of clouds, you'll see the slugs during the day. So, but if you're seeing them during the day, yeah, no doubt you can definitely see more of them at night. Here's a good suggestion from Sari Lou. I have a black light flashlight for minerals, rocks, and uranium glass. Cool. So I haven't talked a lot about it. I have some videos planned as I continue the build out of my garden. But the hardscape, I mentioned it briefly a little while ago. The hardscape in your garden, the things that you put in that are not plants, can actually be designed for different seasons, different times of day. And so I like rocks in the garden, and especially when you can choose rocks that will reflect sunlight and they'll have different colors and they'll look different ways. Absolutely. But sure, do the same thing for a nighttime garden so that as you shine your flashlight, you're getting some of those colors, you're getting some of the reflections, you're getting kind of an interactive experience when you go out anytime, but especially at night when you might not normally have enjoyed the garden space. It can add an interesting component. And I like keeping the garden interesting with new plants, with new experiences, with all those kind of things. So get out there and do something to get the garden exciting. Because I know this sounds kind of backwards, but to me, the exciting garden is what I find relaxing. It's it's going out there and it's that initial, oh, that's so cool. And then you pause and you just soak in the moment. That's where the relaxation for me comes in, where I see something that maybe I haven't seen before, or I see something again that I enjoyed from before, and it just makes me want to stand or sit and do more of that particular experience. And that's what I find so enjoyable. So absolutely, get out there and try some new things that you may not have done before. Mobius says, when the ground is covered with snow, it's hard to remember the lush green growth, and the opposite is true during summer. Oh, sure. But you don't necessarily have to remember what it was like 6 months before. Soak up that moment. The snow-covered garden has a beauty all its own. And I try to enjoy the snow when the snow's there, because sometimes it is hard to remember what the green looked like, and that can be depressing. So don't try to remember the green. Just enjoy the white when you have that white and can sit out. Yeah, sunset gazing says I can enjoy sitting out longer without getting sunburn. You know, and that's another interesting perspective as the seasons change and the shoulder seasons. You can spend more time in the garden. Assuming you've got more time in your day, you can spend more time in the garden because you're not getting sunburned. You're not getting all hot and sweaty. And you might be out there long enough to see some of these variations in the wildlife or the weather or whatever factors that you find relaxing and maybe even stimulating in the garden. Absolutely. It's one of those kind of things that uh, don't don't miss out on those opportunities, because now you have some ideas to try. Now you have some ideas to get out there and do it. And like the black light, like Sari Lou just says, I never thought about that. Yeah, that's kind of the idea today, is to try some things that maybe you didn't think about, and they'll bring you the enjoyment. They'll bring you the relaxation that the that you didn't even know you were missing. But now that you have it, you're sorry you missed it for as long as you have. And now you just add it to more of the gardening experiences. When I was very young, a long time ago, we would spend a lot of time outside at night playing. We had games where we would play in the dark. You know, it's a wonder that we never tripped and broke our nose or cracked our heads running through the dark fields of our youth. But as an adult, we kind of lose that. We lose that excitement of just being outside because we can be outside. There's no school that you have to get up early for. You're a kid. The weather's warm, so you're going to stay out as long as you can. Well, do it as an adult. Why not? Try to bring some of that childhood enjoyment into your life. I'm guessing most, if not all of you, have those kind of experiences from your youth when you were a kid and your mom had to call you in and you didn't want to come in. And then your dad had to get up and yell at you. And then you came in, but you didn't want to come in. You wanted to spend as much time as possible outside. I know these days kids seem to want to spend the time in front of the TV, playing their games, whatever it is they're doing. But once you get outside, and you experience the outside with those really key moments, you don't want to come in. And so don't. You know, I'll go out and sit on my patio watching the dogs with every intent of coming in. It'll be late afternoon, maybe early evening. I'm just going to go out and just enjoy the moment and then come in and just do my regular nighttime schedule. But every now and then, and I realize not often enough, I stay outside as the sun sets, as the stars come out, especially when you've got some of the crazy moons like we've been having, where you've got a super harvest blood moon. Well, yeah, you should be outside enjoying the moon on those kind of nights. And if you can enjoy those kind of experiences in the garden, why not? I've talked a few times in the past when an eclipse, a solar eclipse was happening, and I mentioned if you were in an area where an eclipse was happening, observe it from the garden. It's an amazing experience. Well, the same happens with a lunar eclipse. Lunar eclipses are different than the solar eclipse, of course, but it does make the moon look different. And if you can observe a full moon, a solar eclipse, a waning moon, a waxing moon, whatever kind of moon you like, especially if it's one of those romantic moons that you've got somewhere from your memories, in your happy place, in your garden, the moon just takes on a completely new experience. And the observation of that really becomes something that is is fun and is enjoyable and can create some of those memories that you didn't even think you needed, but now you just can't get them out of your mind. So I just love those kind of things. Sunset gazing, thank you for that. If you have a garden and a library, you have everything you need. The morning activities in particular, I haven't done enough of this, so I should probably add it to my repertoire, because I think Cicero has something. Uh, I've got some relatives. My mother used to do this, the early morning reading, starting her day by reading a book. And if you've got that spot in your garden and you like to read, sure, start your morning by reading a book, whatever kind of book you like. But gardening poetry could be one of those things that the poet evokes emotions through the poetry that you can just turn your head and see all around you. It's these things that are hard to plan for unless somebody suggests it to you or unless somebody else mentions that it's something they do. Who knows? Maybe take one of these ideas that we've talked about today and add it to your gardening repertoire and try and get out there, try it. And then, of course, you can share with us if it's something that you want to share at a future point when we're talking about a similar topic. I'd love to hear those things that are encouraging you and calming to you to really make gardening something special, particularly as we move into this seasonal change that's going to affect us typically negatively because of all that extra stress or that extra effort or the fact that we're losing this wonderful growing garden that we have, and we're not going to see it again for many months. When my freeze comes sometime next month, my garden's not going to look good like it does now until next July. So, I'm looking at 9 or 10 months before I get to the point that I can enjoy the big, lush green garden. So there's got to be something to fill in all that space. And that's kind of the focus that I've been trying to highlight today, is it can be something other than the big, lush, green growing garden. There are still those energy locations. There's still lots of life. There's still lots to see. So get out there, see it, and then share it with others. Share it with me. And I'd certainly love to hear what those kind of things are that you've experienced. Next week, it's a whole new experience. I'll be back next Monday. We'll be talking about another topic as well as answering your questions. And I'll be seeking all of your recommendations and advice from what you're doing to help modify me as well. And thanks to Heidi and Jay, of course, fantastic moderators, and all of you who make this community so fantastic. Have a great gardening week. Try to relax along the way, and I'll see you here next week.